Hey guys! Welcome back to another long, cozy, slightly meandering history ramble. This is one of those nights where we're not in a hurry. So dim the lights, flop down somewhere comfortable, and let your brain coast along. Tonight, we're starting with something that sounds charming at first. Bread. Because bread is comfort. Bread is warm and soft, and, if you live in the 21st century, usually not deadly. But, in Victorian Britain, bread could literally ruin your week. Sometimes your life. Because being a baker back then, it wasn't just about kneading dough and getting flour on your apron. It was one of those jobs where, well, hopefully you don't inhale too much poison today, was part of the description. Let's ease into this. The deadly job of the Victorian baker. So, here's the thing. In the early 1800s, Britain was busy industrializing. Which meant pollution, coal dust, and a lot of weird shortcuts in food production. And bakers, bless them, were right in the middle of it. Flour itself wasn't always pure. Sometimes it was stretched with chalk. Or alum. Alum is basically aluminum sulfate. It makes bread look whiter and puffier. And Victorians loved white bread. Because if you ate brown bread, that meant you were poor. And obviously, everyone wanted to look like they weren't poor. Even if the price was slowly poisoning yourself. So bakers got their hands on sacks of flour that might already have questionable additives in it. Then they'd throw in a little more themselves. Because, why not double down? If one pinch of alum makes bread look good, 2 pinches will make it look fantastic. Customers didn't complain, because the loaves looked perfect. Never mind that alum in large doses causes digestive meltdowns. Imagine biting into a slice of bread that looked fluffy, but immediately gave you cramps. And you're sitting there thinking, worth it. That's basically Victorian dining. And let's not forget the working conditions of the bakers themselves. Baking was an all-night job. Ovens needed to be heated, dough needed time to rise, and people wanted their bread first thing in the morning. So bakers often started around 11 p.m. Worked until sunrise. Went home exhausted. Slept in random shifts. Their lives basically ran in reverse compared to the rest of society. So you've got flour dust everywhere, alum powder flying around, and bakers breathing it all in while standing in front of giant coal-fired ovens. Hot, smoky, and full of ash. If you weren't poisoned by flour additives, you were choked by coal fumes. Truly a glamorous profession. And just to add insult to injury, bakers didn't make much money. They were considered skilled, but not prestigious. More like, thanks for the bread, now go back to your basement oven, please. Fun with arsenic. Now, alum wasn't the only trick in the Victorian pantry. Bakers sometimes stretched their flour with, you guessed it, arsenic. Because arsenic was cheap, available, and very white. Perfect for making bread look like a porcelain sculpture. It sounds wild now, but arsenic was literally everywhere in the 19th century. Wallpaper, cosmetics, candies, medicines. If you weren't eating it, you were probably wearing it. So tossing a little into the flour bag didn't raise as many red flags as you'd think. Until people started dropping dead. One of the most famous bread poisoning disasters happened in 1858, in Bradford. Not with bakers this time, but with candy. A sweet shop accidentally used arsenic instead of sugar. Around 20 people died. Dozens were sick. The Victorian newspapers had a field day. And yet, bakeries kept fiddling with additives for decades. Because profit margins. Because customers wanted that pure white loaf. And because the government wasn't exactly fast with regulation. Britain's first Food Adulteration Act came in 1860. Which sounds good. Except it was basically a, please stop poisoning people, if you feel like it, kind of law. No real teeth. It wasn't until later acts in the 1870s and 1880s that bakers were officially banned from tossing half the periodic table into their dough. By then, a couple of generations had already built up some interesting digestive resilience. Sleepy side note: why white bread was such a big deal? Let's float sideways for a moment. Because it's worth asking, why were Victorians so obsessed with white bread? Partly, it's class signaling. If your bread is white, it means it's been refined, milled carefully, which costs money. If it's brown, that means you're eating the whole grain, what poor people had to make do with. Ironically, today we think whole wheat is healthier. But in Victorian times, brown bread was a badge of poverty. There's also a psychological thing. White bread just looked clean. And Victorians were deeply into the idea of purity. Even while living in smog-choked, sewage-filled cities. It was the aesthetic that mattered. Yes, my lungs are black from coal dust, but at least my bread is white. So bakers leaned into the demand. And if that meant sprinkling in alum, chalk, or arsenic, so be it. Customers didn't care, until they did. The bakers themselves. Now, let's not forget, these poor souls weren't just making bread, they were living the bread. Bakers often lived right above or next to their bakehouses. Their clothes were permanently dusted with flour. Their hands were rough from kneading dough and burned from pulling trays in and out of ovens. They also had some charming workplace hazards. Flour mills sometimes used lead pipes to carry water, which, of course, leached into the flour. Lead poisoning, anyone? And then there was the fire risk. Coal ovens didn't exactly come with safety features. Fires in bakeries were common. Insurance wasn't always available. If your bakery went up in flames, you were simply done. It makes you wonder why anyone did it at all. But the answer is simple: people always need bread. And if you had the skill, you could find work. Even if it slowly killed you. Moving on from bread. So, that's the tale of the Victorian baker. A life full of flour, fire, and the occasional dose of poison. But don't worry. Tonight's story buffet isn't just carbs. We're going to float gently over to other weird, dark corners of history. The theme is basically, jobs or lifestyles that looked respectable, but were secretly awful. Next up, let's talk about another group who had it rough: chimney sweeps. Chimney sweeps and their tiny apprentices. Now, chimney sweeps are a staple of Victorian imagery. You picture a cheerful man with a top hat, covered in soot, maybe dancing on rooftops if you've watched too much Mary Poppins. Reality? Not so charming. Because many sweeps weren't grown men at all. They were kids. Sometimes as young as 6. Apprenticed, or really, sold, into the trade. They were small enough to crawl into narrow chimneys. Imagine wriggling your way up a dark, soot-caked shaft barely wide enough for your body. That was the job. And it wasn't optional. If you got stuck, the master sweep might light a small fire at the bottom. Just enough heat to encourage you to move along. Nothing says career motivation like flames licking at your heels. The kids inhaled soot daily, scratched up their skin, and often developed a charming condition called chimney sweeps cancer. It was one of the first industrial cancers ever documented. Tumors would form in, you guessed it, the scrotum. Because soot collected in the folds of the skin. Yes. A job where your career path was basically, crawl, cough, cancer. All before you turned 30. And that, my sleepy friends, is how the Victorian world worked. Bakers, sweeps, factory kids, everyone had their own small slice of industrial misery. But, hey, at least the bread looked good on the table. We'll keep drifting further into these little historical detours. Next stop, let's explore how being a Victorian doctor wasn't much safer than being their patient. But, let's save that for the next part. Alright. Let's shuffle our way from bakers and chimney sweeps into the warm and fuzzy world of Victorian medicine. Spoiler, warm and fuzzy is the opposite of what it actually was. Doctors in the 19th century liked to see themselves as highly professional. They wore waistcoats, carried fancy canes, and spoke in a confident tone. Which was impressive, considering that most of them were basically just guessing. If you walked into a Victorian doctor's office, your odds of walking back out were 50-50 at best. Let's drift into this slowly. The Golden Age of Bloodletting. The idea of bloodletting goes way back. Ancient Greece, medieval Europe, pretty much every era had someone with a blade and a bowl ready to drain you. And while the Victorians had microscopes and were starting to figure out germs, they still couldn't quite let go of the classics. So yes, you could still show up to a doctor in the 1850s and be told, "Oh, you've got a fever. Let's bleed you. That'll fix it." Doctors used lancets, tiny blades, or even a device called a scarificator. Which sounds like a horror movie prop, but was actually a spring-loaded box full of blades. You'd press it against the skin, trigger it, and shink, out came the blood. And if blades weren't your vibe, there were leeches. Always leeches. Apothecaries ordered them by the thousands. Everyone from aristocrats to working-class families had jars of them at home. Some doctors swore by them. Others admitted they didn't really know what they were doing, but hey, the patient looked slightly paler afterward, so maybe it worked. Victorian hospitals, not where you wanted to be. Now, let's picture a hospital around 1840. You might imagine neat rows of beds, clean sheets, and nurses bustling quietly. Nope. Victorian hospitals were chaotic, overcrowded, and, let's be blunt, filthy. Surgeons wore the same coats for years. The more bloodstains, the better. It was like a badge of honor. If your frock coat looked freshly laundered, you clearly weren't cutting enough people open. And cleanliness? Forget it. Instruments weren't sterilized. Hands weren't washed. A surgeon might move from an amputation to delivering a baby without pausing to rinse. Lovely. This led to something politely called hospitalism, which basically meant people who entered hospitals tended to die. Post-surgery infections were common. Childbirth fever swept through maternity wards. The phrase, "catching something at the hospital," wasn't paranoia, it was practically guaranteed. The curious case of anesthesia. One bright spot in Victorian medicine was the arrival of anesthesia. Before the 1840s, surgery was a matter of tying you down, handing you a stick to bite, and hoping the surgeon was quick. Then along came ether and chloroform. Suddenly, patients could be knocked out. Surgeons loved it, because it meant they could take their time. Which was both good and bad. Before, speed was everything, you wanted the leg off in under 2 minutes. With anesthesia, surgeons could poke around for hours. Not necessarily great when germs were still a mystery. Chloroform had its own risks, too. Give too much, and the patient just didn't wake up. Queen Victoria famously used chloroform during the birth of her 8th child in 1853, which helped make it fashionable. If it was good enough for the Queen, it was good enough for everyone. But let's be real. She also had a palace full of doctors. You, the average patient, might be getting knocked out by a local barber surgeon with questionable measuring skills. Doctors and their interesting treatments. Victorian doctors prescribed all sorts of things. Mercury was a favorite, especially for syphilis. The saying went, "One night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." Which sounds poetic, until you realize mercury poisoning causes tremors, madness, and death. Opium was everywhere, too. Available in liquid form as laudanum, it was poured into everything from cough syrup to baby soothing syrups. Yes, Victorian parents gave their infants opium. Because nothing says responsible parenting like drugging your toddler so you can sleep. And arsenic? Still in the mix. Some doctors recommended small doses for various ailments, including indigestion and nervous complaints. If you were tired, anxious, or just feeling off, here, have a pinch of poison. Of course, none of this was carefully measured. Doses varied wildly. Doctors often relied on patient feedback, like, does this feel better, or worse? No. Well, here's a little more. Florence Nightingale, the lone voice of cleanliness. Among the chaos, one figure stood out, Florence Nightingale. You probably know her as the lady with the lamp, wandering through hospitals during the Crimean War. But her real legacy was basically screaming, "Wash your hands, you filthy people." Nightingale emphasized hygiene, ventilation, and fresh air. Radical concepts, apparently. She reduced death rates drastically just by cleaning wards and demanding basic sanitation. She wasn't perfect, she still clung to some outdated ideas, but compared to her peers, she was practically modern. It's ironic. The woman remembered as a gentle angel with a lamp was actually more of a tough, stubborn reformer who bulldozed her way through medical bureaucracy. If you imagine her as soft-spoken and saintly, think again. More like, wash this floor or I'll haunt you. Doctors versus midwives. Another fun Victorian medical drama was the rivalry between doctors and midwives. Midwives had been delivering babies for centuries. Then male doctors decided they wanted in on the business. Because, of course, childbirth should now involve a man with a degree. The problem? Doctors often made things worse. They moved between wards, delivering babies after amputations, without washing their hands. Cue outbreaks of puerperal fever, childbed fever, that killed mothers at terrifying rates. Hungarian doctor Ignaz Semmelweis famously suggested doctors should wash their hands with chlorine before attending births. Mortality rates plummeted where he enforced it. But his colleagues laughed him off. Because obviously, gentlemen didn't need to wash their hands. That was for servants. Semmelweis died in an asylum, ridiculed. Meanwhile, women kept dying in droves. Victorian progress, ladies and gentlemen. Medical quacks and oddballs. Now, if you didn't trust mainstream doctors, and who could blame you, you might end up with a quack. These were practitioners of alternative medicine, peddling tonics, powders, and miracle cures. Some sold electrotherapy machines. Others promoted water cures, basically, being doused in cold water for everything from gout to depression. Homeopathy was also rising in popularity, with its like cures like philosophy and highly diluted remedies. Were these any worse than mercury and arsenic? Hard to say. At least homeopathy was mostly just sugar pills. Which, compared to mercury, was practically health food. So, was it all bad? To be fair, Victorian medicine wasn't all doom. The period saw real advances. Germ theory slowly gained traction, thanks to scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Antiseptics started to be used by surgeons like Joseph Lister. Microscopes improved. Medical schools became more structured. But for the average patient in 1850, your choices were still: trust the local doctor with his leeches and mercury, buy a random tonic from a quack, or just stay home and hope your body figured it out. Frankly, option 3 was often the safest. Floating to the next disaster. So, that's Victorian medicine in a nutshell, a mix of confidence, ignorance, and occasional brilliance. The doctors meant well, most of them, anyway, but without proper understanding of germs, they were basically operating in the dark. Now, let's glide over to another, respectable, Victorian profession that turned out to be less than glamorous. Undertakers. Because if the doctors didn't kill you, someone had to clean up the mess. Victorian undertakers and the business of death. So, we've gone from bakers with their arsenic bread, to doctors with their leeches and chloroform. And now, we drift naturally into the next step in the Victorian pipeline of misery. The undertakers. Because if you were unlucky enough to survive the bread and the doctors, someone still had to manage your exit. And in the 19th century, that job was practically an industry. Let's tuck ourselves in and wade through the velvet curtains of Victorian mourning culture. Death, but make it fashion. Victorians were obsessed with death. Which, to be fair, makes sense. Life expectancy in 1850s London was barely 40 for men. Infant mortality was high. Cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, basically everything wanted you dead. So, instead of ignoring it, Victorians leaned in. Hard. Funerals weren't just sad family gatherings. They were full-scale productions. Black horses, plumed headdresses, velvet-lined coffins. The undertaker wasn't just someone with a shovel, he was an event planner. The goal was to show the neighborhood that you were respectable. That you had taste. That your family could afford a really nice casket. And this is where undertakers thrived. They became masters of upselling. Would you like your coffin plain, or with brass handles? Simple black carriage, or 6-horse procession with ostrich feathers? Basically the Victorian version of, would you like to supersize that? Mourning dress codes. Undertakers didn't just handle coffins. They also helped enforce the rigid rules of mourning fashion. Widows, in particular, were expected to wear black for 2 years. And not just any black, jet black. Dresses, veils, gloves, parasols. If you wore anything shiny, it had to be jet, a gemstone made from fossilized wood. There were entire shops dedicated to mourning clothes. Because heaven forbid you show up to Sunday service in the wrong shade of grief. Neighbors noticed. Gossip spread. Oh, she's only been widowed 6 months and she's already wearing lavender. Shocking. And yes, undertakers cashed in by partnering with these shops. They knew grief was a business opportunity. The more elaborate your mourning, the better they looked, too. Funeral hardware, Victorian style. Now, let's talk about the actual equipment. Victorian coffins weren't just boxes. They came with little extras. One favorite was the coffin plate, a decorative metal plate on top, engraved with your name and dates. Kind of like the Victorian equivalent of a personalized phone case. Except, you know, final. Some coffins even had little glass windows. So mourners could peek inside and confirm the person was really there. Sometimes they even left these on for public viewings. Imagine walking into a parlor and there's Aunt Margaret, neatly arranged, visible through a tiny coffin window. Cozy. And then, of course, there were the safety coffins. Victorians had a morbid fear of being buried alive. Which wasn't entirely irrational. Medical science wasn't great at confirming death. So inventors came up with coffins equipped with bells, air pipes, even ladders. The idea was, if you woke up underground, you could signal for help. How many people were actually saved this way? Almost none. But the idea sold. And undertakers were happy to market it. Because nothing says restful sleep like a bell on standby, just in case. The funereal economy. For undertakers, funerals were a steady business. The Industrial Revolution created dense, urban populations, and with them came new urban cemeteries. Parish graveyards were full. London built massive cemeteries like Highgate and Kensal Green. Suddenly, funerals were a big-ticket industry, not just a small parish matter. Undertakers formed guilds, established professional codes, and basically turned into death impresarios. They kept catalogs of coffin styles, horse-drawn hearses, plumes, and even mourning stationery. Yes, you could order pre-printed black-bordered cards to send out as death announcements. Very efficient. And they weren't cheap. A lower-class funeral might eat up months of wages. Families often went into debt just to bury someone respectably. Undertakers knew this and leaned into it. Because nothing was worse than being thought shabby in death. Enter the body snatchers. Now, undertakers weren't the only people dealing with corpses. Let's drift briefly to another Victorian career path, body snatching. Medical schools needed cadavers. The law only allowed the dissection of executed criminals, which didn't supply nearly enough bodies for a growing student population. So, entrepreneurs stepped in. Body snatchers, called resurrection men, dug up fresh graves, hauled out corpses, and sold them to medical schools. They made decent money, though obviously, it wasn't the most popular profession. Families started guarding graves, sometimes with iron cages called mortsafes. Cemeteries hired night watchmen. The most infamous case, of course, was Burke and Hare in Edinburgh. They skipped the digging and just murdered people to sell fresh corpses. Which, honestly, was efficient. Morally horrific, but efficient. Undertakers hated body snatchers, because grave robbing made everyone nervous. Families started demanding secure coffins and vaults, which meant more expense. So, in a roundabout way, even the criminals helped the undertaker's bottom line. Mourning photography. Another little slice of Victorian death culture, post-mortem photography. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Families would hire photographers to capture one final portrait of their deceased loved one. Sometimes the dead were propped up to look alive, posed in chairs, surrounded by family, eyes painted open on the print. Other times, they were photographed lying peacefully in their coffins. Today it feels morbid. But in an age when photography was expensive and rare, many families had no photos of their children until after they died. The post-mortem picture was the only memory. Undertakers often coordinated these sessions, making sure the body was presentable. Undertaker fashion. We can't forget the undertakers themselves. These weren't scruffy gravediggers. They dressed sharply, in black suits with top hats, gloves, and canes. The look projected dignity. They wanted to appear more like gentlemen than tradesmen. Some even hired mutes, professional mourners dressed in black, who stood silently outside the house during the funeral procession. Their job was literally just to look sad. Because nothing says grief like paying a stranger to frown convincingly at your doorway. Queen Victoria, mourning on steroids. Of course, the ultimate Victorian mourner was Queen Victoria herself. When Prince Albert died in 1861, she went into mourning and basically never stopped. She wore black for the next 40 years. Her example set the tone for everyone else. If the Queen was living in eternal grief, then society followed suit. Undertakers must have silently thanked her. Because the longer black remained fashionable, the more they could market mourning goods. Victoria kept Albert's rooms untouched, his clothes laid out, as if he might return. She even had meals served for him. Undertakers couldn't have asked for a better advertisement for extended mourning culture. The sleepy takeaway. So, Victorian undertakers lived in this strange world where grief was ritualized, monetized, and heavily accessorized. They weren't just digging holes, they were curating an experience. It was somber, it was expensive, and it was sometimes absurd. But it gave families a sense of dignity. And it gave undertakers a very steady income. Now, let's drift away from coffins and ostrich-plumed hearses. We've been hanging around too many dead Victorians. For the next part, I think we should float toward the royals. Because while commoners were busy choking on alum bread and paying for over-the-top funerals, the upper crust had their own brand of misery. And it usually came with crowns, cousins, and a lot of bad genetics. Royalty, inbred, unlucky, and occasionally potato-shaped. So far tonight, we've had bakers poisoning their customers, doctors guessing with leeches, and undertakers making bank on ostrich feathers. It feels only fair now to glide up the social ladder. Because the royals, those glittering figures at the top of society, were often just as miserable. Sometimes more so. Being royal might sound like the cushiest gig in history: castles, jewels, armies, all the bread you can eat. But peel back the velvet curtain, and what you usually find is a lonely, anxious person married to their cousin, slowly collapsing under the weight of bad genetics and court gossip. Let's float right into one of the most infamous examples. Charles II of Spain, the hexed king. Charles II of Spain reigned in the late 1600s, but his reputation stuck around as the poster child for royal inbreeding. He was nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Which sounds mysterious, but was really just a polite way of saying, something is very, very wrong here. Charles came from the Habsburg dynasty, a family famous for its habit of marrying close relatives. They wanted to keep power in the family. Which they did. Along with every recessive gene imaginable. By the time Charles was born, the family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled knot. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were also closely related. If you do the math, Charles's genetic diversity was about as wide as a puddle. The results weren't pretty. Portraits show him with that classic Habsburg jaw, long, drooping, and so pronounced he couldn't properly chew. His tongue was too big for his mouth. He drooled constantly. He didn't learn to talk until he was 4. Didn't learn to walk until he was 8. And yet, this was the King of Spain. One of the richest empires on earth at the time, technically ruled by a man who could barely stand without help. Charles's reign was basically one long struggle to produce an heir. He married twice. Neither marriage worked. One wife allegedly said she felt like she was married to a child. Which, honestly, wasn't far from the truth. By his 30s, Charles was a physical wreck. He had seizures, infections, digestive problems. When he finally died at age 38, an autopsy reported he had a heart the size of a peppercorn, lungs corroded, intestines rotten, a single testicle black as coal, and his head full of water. Not exactly a flattering exit summary. But, hey, his reign gave Spain a lasting legacy, the War of the Spanish Succession. All because nobody thought maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop marrying their nieces. Queen Victoria's descendants and the curse of hemophilia. Now, let's drift forward to the 1800s. Queen Victoria of Britain is remembered as this stern grandmother of Europe, with endless portraits of her in black. She had 9 children, and through them, half the royal families of Europe ended up related. And along with her descendants, she spread hemophilia. Hemophilia is a blood disorder where clotting doesn't work properly. A small cut can turn dangerous. A bump can cause internal bleeding. For Victorian royals, it was a nightmare. Medicine at the time had no cure. Victoria herself wasn't affected, but she carried the gene. Her son Leopold had it. He bled severely from minor injuries and died young. Several of her grandsons inherited it too. Most famously, Alexei, the son of Tsar Nicholas II and Alexandra of Russia. Alexei's hemophilia shaped Russian history. His illness terrified his parents, who turned desperately to anyone promising help. Enter Rasputin, the wandering mystic with questionable hygiene but an uncanny ability to calm the boy. Without Alexei's condition, Rasputin probably would have been laughed out of the palace. Instead, he became a central figure, helping destabilize the Romanov dynasty. So, in a roundabout way, Queen Victoria's bloodline didn't just spread royal genes, it may have helped usher in the Russian Revolution. Quite the family gift. Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king who avoided reality. Now, let's wander to Bavaria. Ludwig II, mid-1800s. Known as the fairy tale king. Which sounds charming, until you realize it was mostly a polite euphemism for hopelessly impractical. Ludwig loved castles. Not just normal castles, extravagant, storybook palaces with turrets, murals, and enough gold leaf to blind you. His most famous project was Neuschwanstein, which looks like it was designed by a Disney intern on too much caffeine. The problem? Ludwig wasn't actually interested in ruling. He skipped cabinet meetings, avoided public events, and spent most of his time hiding in his fantasy castles, commissioning operas from Richard Wagner. He'd ride around at night in elaborate sleighs shaped like swans. Very regal. Very not useful. The government eventually declared him insane and deposed him. Days later, Ludwig's body was found floating in a lake, along with the doctor assigned to watch him. Officially, it was suicide by drowning. But the water was shallow. Conspiracies swirled. Was he murdered? Did he just trip? Nobody really knows. What we do know, Ludwig left behind castles that now make millions in tourist revenue. Which is ironic, considering Bavaria spent decades paying off his debts. King George III, the mad king who wasn't always mad. Let's pop back to Britain for a moment. George III, famous as the Mad King, who lost the American colonies. George actually reigned for decades, and for much of that time, he was stable and conscientious. But later in life, he suffered from bouts of severe mental illness. He'd talk endlessly for hours, repeat himself, and sometimes have violent outbursts. Historians have debated the cause. Some say porphyria, a rare blood disorder. Others suggest bipolar disorder. Whatever it was, it left him unable to govern. His son, the future George IV, took over as regent. The tragic part? George was a devoted family man. He loved farming, science, and domestic life. He wasn't a tyrant, but his illness overshadowed everything else. By the end, he was blind, deaf, and delusional, locked away in Windsor Castle. The king who started his reign with stability ended it in lonely decline. The irony of royal life. Looking at these royals, you start to notice a theme. Their lives were gilded cages. Surrounded by luxury, but also by pressure, isolation, and often disastrous genetics. Marrying within the family seemed smart politically, alliances were tight, inheritance was secure. But it left them fragile. Sickly. And sometimes, like Charles II, almost comically unfit for rule. It's a reminder that titles and crowns don't guarantee health or happiness. Sometimes, being royal just meant your tragedies were embroidered in gold thread. Drifting onward. So we've covered poisoned bread, leech-happy doctors, stylish undertakers, and royals who could barely stand upright. Not exactly a cheerful bedtime playlist, but strangely soothing, in its own gloomy way. In our next gentle ramble, let's drift into the children of royalty. Because if adult kings and queens were disasters, the kids didn't stand much of a chance either. Spoiled, sickly, or shoved into political marriages before puberty. A bedtime storybook of sadness, really. Sad, sickly, and spoiled, royal children through the ages. So, let's drift from the drooling Habsburgs and fairy tale Bavarian kings over to the nurseries of palaces. Because royal childhood wasn't all golden rattles and miniature crowns. It was usually a mix of disease, suffocating protocol, and the occasional emotional breakdown. And unlike regular kids, these little royals didn't have the freedom to climb trees, scrape their knees, and then get yelled at for ruining their clothes. They had nurses, governesses, tutors, and an entire nation silently judging whether they'd survive to adulthood without keeling over from smallpox. Let's start with a particularly unlucky little prince. Ivan VI of Russia, baby Tsar, lifelong prisoner. Imagine being crowned emperor at just 2 months old. Sounds impressive. But Ivan VI of Russia didn't exactly get to enjoy it. He inherited the throne in 1740, technically as an infant. Naturally, his mother ruled as regent. Court factions bickered, plots thickened, and by the time Ivan was a year old, he was overthrown by Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great. Where do you put a baby ex-emperor? Apparently, in prison. Ivan spent almost his entire life locked away in remote fortresses. He grew up isolated, forbidden books or education. Guards weren't even allowed to talk to him. Imagine your entire childhood being solitary confinement, but with better wallpaper. By the time he reached adulthood, he was mentally fragile. When soldiers later tried to free him, his captors panicked and stabbed him to death. At 23, the baby emperor was gone. A life that never really left the nursery. Edward VI of England, the boy king with no immune system. Next stop, Tudor England. Henry VIII's long-awaited son, Edward VI. Henry had torn England apart, beheaded wives, and rebranded religion just to get this kid. You'd think Edward would be robust, given all the chaos invested in his birth. Spoiler, he wasn't. Edward was crowned at 9 years old. He was intelligent, well-educated, and devoutly Protestant. But physically? He was sickly, frail, and constantly coughing. Portraits show a thin, pale boy, more library than battlefield. By 15, he was coughing up blood, probably tuberculosis. He withered away, leaving the throne to Lady Jane Grey in a desperate attempt to prevent a Catholic restoration. His short reign gave England yet another dynastic mess. All that fuss from Henry, just for his son to die before shaving. Louis XVII of France, the lost dauphin. Then there's the heartbreaking case of Louis XVII, son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. When the French Revolution hit, the royal family was imprisoned. Little Louis, the dauphin, was separated from his mother and locked in a tower cell. Revolutionary guards tried to re-educate him by forcing him to sing revolutionary songs, drink heavily, and swear at his parents' memory. Charming. By the age of 10, he was neglected, filthy, and ill. He died alone in prison, his body scarred with disease and abuse. The monarchy's hope for the future reduced to a forgotten child in a dark cell. And yet, rumors persisted that he survived. For decades, imposters popped up across Europe claiming to be the lost prince. DNA tests in the 20th century finally confirmed the heart preserved from his autopsy matched Marie Antoinette's family. So, no fairy tale escape. Just tragedy. Alfonso XIII of Spain, born with a crown. Some kids inherit toys. Alfonso XIII of Spain inherited a crown, literally at birth in 1886. His father had died months earlier, so when Alfonso was born, he was immediately proclaimed king. The maternity ward doubled as a coronation. The press loved the symbolism. Imagine being declared sovereign while still in swaddling clothes. But the reality? His early life was basically one long parade of regents and politicians ruling in his name until he was old enough. Alfonso grew up spoiled but anxious. When he finally took control, his reign was rocky, dictatorships, political instability, and eventually exile. A king from the crib, but never really secure on the throne. The Habsburg kids, portraits of fragility. Let's drift back to the Habsburgs for a moment. Because no discussion of tragic royal children is complete without them. Take, for example, the daughters of Philip IV of Spain. Their portraits, painted by Velázquez, show tiny girls dressed like stiff dolls, buried in layers of satin, their faces pale and solemn. Childhood in the Spanish court meant no play, no running, no laughter, just standing still while everyone judged your marriage prospects. Infant mortality was high. The Habsburgs were so inbred that many children didn't live past toddlerhood. Those who did often carried visible deformities. The nursery was less a place of play than a waiting room for dynastic politics. Sickly princes everywhere. It wasn't just the Habsburgs. Across Europe, sickly royal children were the norm. Smallpox scarred or killed many heirs. Scarlet fever, measles, and influenza swept through palaces just as easily as peasant cottages. Royal doctors, remember them from earlier, helped speed things along with their bleeding and mercury treatments. Sometimes, a single epidemic would wipe out half a royal nursery. Queens were judged not just by producing children, but by whether those children survived long enough to be useful pawns in marriage negotiations. It was a grim scoreboard. Spoiled and useless, the other extreme. Not every royal child was tragic. Some were just spoiled into uselessness. Take Louis XIV's great-grandson, Louis XV's heir. Surrounded by luxury, courtiers, and constant flattery, he grew into a shy, indecisive boy. The system that protected him from every discomfort also left him incapable of ruling effectively. By the time he ascended, he was unprepared, timid, and quickly overshadowed by advisors. Royal nurseries could be gilded cages. Too much protection meant the child grew into a fragile adult, overwhelmed by the reality of power. Queen Victoria's brood. We can't skip Queen Victoria's 9 children. Her nursery was essentially a factory for European royalty. Each child was married off strategically, spreading her influence like ivy across palaces. But not all were happy. Leopold, her hemophiliac son, lived in constant pain and died young after a fall. Alice, one of her daughters, passed hemophilia on to her descendants, including the doomed Russian Tsarevich. Several of Victoria's children resented her overbearing personality. She was famously controlling and emotionally distant. Her daughter Vicky, married to the German crown prince, clashed endlessly with her domineering mother-in-law in Berlin. Her son Edward VII spent decades as a playboy, desperate to escape his mother's shadow. The nursery looked like a dynasty machine. But emotionally, it was often cold, regimented, and loveless. The irony of royal childhood. So, what do we learn from all this? Royal children weren't living fairy tales. They were more like chess pieces, shuffled around, protected to the point of fragility, or neglected into sickness. If they survived disease, they were pushed into arranged marriages before puberty. If they didn't survive, they became symbols of dynastic tragedy. Either way, their childhoods were rarely happy. Behind the gold rattles and velvet cradles, most royal nurseries echoed with coughing, loneliness, and the weight of expectation. Drifting ahead. So we've rocked through baby emperors in prison, boy kings coughing up blood, dauphin's dying in towers, and spoiled heirs collapsing under velvet cushions. The royal nursery wasn't a safe haven. It was a pressure cooker. Next time, let's step sideways again. Because while royal kids were wasting away in palaces, everyday Victorian kids were being sent up chimneys, into factories, and down mines. Childhood, it turns out, was grim no matter your class, just in very different ways. Little hands, big problems, Victorian childhood outside the palace. Hey again, still here. Nice. Let's keep floating down this oddly relaxing stream of misery. We've talked about princes in towers and baby emperors in cages. But what about the kids who weren't born in gilded nurseries? Victorian Britain loved to pretend it was the most civilized nation in the world. But if you were a child born into poverty around 1850, your civilization usually meant a life expectancy of about 20, a permanent cough, and a job that could kill you before puberty. So let's dim the lights even lower, and drift into the world of chimney sweeps, factory kids, and those cheerful little coal miners who looked about 40 by the time they were 12. Chimney sweeps, childhood in soot. Victorian London loved coal. Everyone was burning it. Which meant chimneys clogged constantly, and someone had to clean them. Enter the chimney sweep boy. Usually between the ages of 5 and 10, though sometimes as young as 4. Small bodies meant easier climbing through the narrow flues. The job was simple: crawl inside, scrape the soot loose, and hope you didn't suffocate, get stuck, or fall to your death. If that sounds horrific, it was. Kids would get permanent respiratory issues. Knees and elbows rubbed raw from crawling on bricks. And occasionally, they'd get wedged in the shaft and die there, because the employer thought, meh, cheaper to get another boy. The charming cherry on top was soot wart, a type of scrotal cancer that often appeared in sweeps who survived into adolescence. It was literally the first occupational cancer ever identified. Yes, Victorian medicine noticed, oh, all the chimney boys are developing weird growths down there. Must be the soot. But hey, at least they sometimes got to slide back down after finishing a job. Like a terrible, carcinogenic playground. Match girls, Fosse jaw and strike action. Now let's step into the world of match factories. Matches were essential, everyone needed them. And the workers who made them? Often young girls, some as young as 10 or 11. They dipped matchsticks into white phosphorus, a substance so toxic it could literally rot your jaw. The condition was called Fosse jaw. It started with toothaches, then abscesses, then bone decay. Eventually, parts of the jawbone would glow faintly in the dark. Yes, your skull lit up like a lantern, but not in a fun way. The smell was horrible, the pain worse, and death followed slowly if untreated. Employers, naturally, blamed the workers for not brushing their teeth enough. Because of course they did. But in 1888, the Match Girls of London organized one of the first successful strikes. They protested the conditions, demanded safer practices, and won. It was a rare victory in a landscape where kids usually didn't have a voice at all. Factory kids, fingers in the machines. Factories were the pride of the Industrial Revolution. Spinning machines, looms, presses, all shiny, loud, and terrifying. And the best way to keep them running smoothly? Hire kids. Their little fingers could dart into the machinery to untangle threads or clear jams. If you're already imagining what happened when the machine kept running while the hand didn't, yes, you're correct. Fingers were lost constantly. Arms too. Shifts lasted 12 to 16 hours. Children stood on aching legs in heat, dust, or chemical fumes. Falls, burns, and mangled limbs were just part of the job description. If a kid cried or slowed down, overseers whipped them to keep pace. Parliament eventually passed factory acts to restrict child labor. But restrict is doing a lot of work here. Even after reforms, plenty of kids were still working 10-hour days in the 1870s. Childhood was basically just an apprenticeship in exhaustion. Coal mine children, the crawlers and trappers. If factories were grim, coal mines were worse. Tiny children were hired as trappers, sitting alone for hours underground, opening and shutting ventilation doors when miners passed. Imagine being 6 years old, stuck in pitch-black tunnels, hearing nothing but dripping water and the occasional rat. Older kids worked as hurriers or putters, dragging heavy coal carts on all fours through narrow tunnels. Chains were sometimes attached to their belts, turning them into little human ponies. Their growth was stunted, their bones deformed, and their lungs full of coal dust. One parliamentary report from the 1840s describes girls as young as 8 working half-naked in mines, because clothes snagged on the tunnels. Inspectors were scandalized, but mostly because of the indecency not the broken spines. Priorities, right? Street kids, the Victorian other London. Of course, not every child worked in factories or mines. Some just lived on the streets. London swarmed with orphans and runaways. They begged, stole, or sold newspapers for pennies. Others were mudlarks, combing through the filthy Thames mud at low tide for scraps of coal, nails, or rope to sell. Charles Dickens wrote about them constantly, which is why we now think every Victorian orphan spoke in Cockney rhymes and had a heart of gold. In reality, most were malnourished, filthy, and constantly at risk of abuse from adults. Philanthropists eventually built ragged schools, orphanages, and reform institutions. Some were genuinely helpful. Others were more like prisons, designed to scrub the poverty off children by making them march, pray, and eat gruel until they broke. Death as a constant companion. Infant and child mortality rates were staggering. In the poorest London districts, 1 in 3 children died before reaching age 5. Cholera, typhus, diphtheria, measles, diseases we now vaccinate against ripped through slums constantly. Doctors were expensive, hospitals overcrowded, and sanitation nearly non-existent. A dirty water pump could wipe out half a neighborhood in a week. Childhood wasn't guaranteed, it was a gamble. And yet, Victorian society romanticized childhood. Paintings showed cherubic children with rosy cheeks and curls, dressed like miniature angels. Meanwhile, the actual kids were coughing up coal dust in tunnels. The cognitive dissonance was peak Victorian. The weird divide. Here's the sleepy irony. At the same time royal nurseries were wrapped in silk and brocade, ordinary children were covered in soot and blisters. One little prince was learning Latin declensions from a tutor while another kid the same age was pulling coal carts underground. One was being painted by Velázquez, the other being scraped out of a chimney. Both groups were fragile, but in completely different ways. The royals were fragile because they were overprotected and inbred. The working-class kids were fragile because they were disposable labor. Either way, childhood wasn't carefree. Drifting forward. So let's gently drift out of the coal dust and away from the matches glowing in the dark. We've wandered from royal nurseries into the mines, and it's all a little bleak. But history's like that, it piles tragedy on tragedy. So maybe next time we float back up to the palaces. Because while working-class kids were losing fingers to factory looms, the royals were still making disastrous marriage choices, throwing lavish parties, and occasionally inventing brand new scandals. And trust me, the palace scandals are endless. Royal marriages gone wrong, when happily ever after meant mutual misery. So, we've done bakers dying of flour dust, baby emperors in dungeons, Bavarian kings building fantasy castles, and Victorian kids glowing in the dark from phosphorus poisoning. Let's go back now to the top tier of dysfunction, royal marriages. Because for royals, marriage wasn't about love. It was about treaties, dynasties, and whether or not your cousin had the right number of teeth. Romance came later, if it came at all. More often, what came later was resentment, betrayal, and the occasional open affair with the stable boy. Let's start with one of the most famously miserable couples. George IV and Caroline of Brunswick, the pettiest pair in Britain. George IV of Britain is best remembered for his waistline, his drinking, and his ability to rack up debt like it was a competitive sport. When it came time to marry, he was pushed into a union with Caroline of Brunswick. He saw her, took one whiff, literally, and declared her the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. She apparently smelled bad, dressed worse, and had the conversational skills of wet cabbage. Caroline, for her part, thought George was bloated, selfish, and drunk. Which, to be fair, he was. Their wedding night? A disaster. George got drunk, consummated the marriage once, apparently with great reluctance, and passed out in the fireplace. The marriage collapsed almost instantly. Caroline was later barred from George's coronation in 1821. She showed up anyway, pounding on the cathedral doors while crowds cheered her on. Guards physically turned her away. 3 weeks later, she was dead. Not from heartbreak, probably from stomach illness. But still, the timing was grimly poetic. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the awkward bedroom years. We've talked about their poor son already, but let's rewind to the parents. Louis XVI of France was shy, indecisive, and more interested in locks and keys than ruling, or romance. Marie Antoinette, shipped from Austria as a teenager, found herself married to a husband who, well, couldn't quite perform. For 7 years. Historians debate whether Louis suffered from phimosis, a painful condition involving, shall we say, tightness, or if he was just nervous. Either way, the couple's lack of children became a European scandal. Pamphlets circulated mocking the impotent king. Eventually, after a medical consultation and maybe a bit of surgery, things worked out. They had 4 children, though only one survived into adulthood. But by then, the gossip had done its work. Let them eat cake was fake, but the image of a frivolous, extravagant queen stuck, and both of them ended up headless. Romantic. Peter III and Catherine the Great, a mismatched Russian pair. Catherine the Great wasn't Russian by birth. She married into it, tied to Peter III, grandson of Peter the Great. You'd think. That sounded impressive. But Peter? He was, not it. He was immature, obsessed with playing toy soldiers, and apparently more interested in drinking and dolls than ruling or romance. On their wedding night, nothing happened. On the second night, nothing. This went on for years. Catherine wrote in her memoirs that Peter took no interest in women, which is a polite way of saying he preferred other hobbies. So Catherine took lovers. Many lovers. And eventually, with the help of one of them, she staged a coup. Peter III was deposed, later mysteriously killed in custody, and Catherine reigned as one of Russia's most powerful monarchs. Honestly, upgrading your husband's toy soldier obsession into an empire of your own is quite the career move. Charles II of Spain and Maria Anna, 2 inbred to function. We can't forget Charles II of Spain, the poster child for Habsburg inbreeding. He was physically deformed, mentally fragile, and incapable of fathering children. Still, dynastic duty meant marriage. Twice. First to Marie-Louise of Orleans. She was young, pretty, and absolutely horrified by her new husband. Their marriage produced no heirs and plenty of misery. Rumors swirled that she starved herself to death rather than endure the Spanish court. Then Charles remarried Maria Anna of Neuburg, who was equally disappointed. Their union also failed to produce children, because by this point Charles was more ghost than man. When he died at 38, childless, Spain's throne collapsed into the War of Spanish Succession. His marriages hadn't saved the dynasty, they had just prolonged the agony. Victoria and Albert, love, but also control issues. Not every royal marriage was loveless. Queen Victoria actually adored her husband, Albert of Saxe-Coburg. She gushed about him constantly, wrote pages of diary entries about their passionate nights, and had 9 children with him. But, because there's always a but, she was also controlling, moody, and domineering. Albert, more reserved, found himself constantly trying to rein in her temper. He handled paperwork, politics, and crises while she oscillated between adoration and irritation. When Albert died young, Victoria plunged into mourning for the rest of her life. She wore black for 40 years, refused public duties, and essentially turned widowhood into her personal brand. Romantic, yes. But also extremely codependent. The Romanovs, a love story with a side of doom. Nicholas II of Russia and Alexandra of Hesse actually loved each other deeply. Which, in royal terms, was already unusual. But it was also a disaster. Alexandra was shy, unpopular at court, and obsessed with mysticism. Their son Alexei inherited hemophilia from her side of the family, leading her to embrace Rasputin, the creepy mystic healer who supposedly could ease his pain. Nicholas was indecisive, politically weak, and more interested in family life than governing. The result was a marriage that was tender at home but catastrophic for Russia. Their love for each other was genuine, but it blinded them to the fact that their empire was falling apart. And we all know how that ended, with abasement in Ekaterinburg. Alfonso VI of Portugal, married, unmarried, remarried. One more curious case, Alfonso VI of Portugal, 17th century. Crippled from childhood illness, mentally unstable, and prone to violent fits. His arranged marriage to Marie Françoise of Savoy went about as well as you'd expect. On their wedding night, nothing happened. After 2 years of non-consummation, Marie Françoise petitioned for annulment, citing Alfonso's incapacity. Ouch! She then married Alfonso's younger brother, Pedro. Yes, her ex-husband's replacement. Pedro soon deposed Alfonso and ruled in his stead. Talk about trading up. The ironic thread. Here's the cozy irony to wrap around yourself like a blanket: these marriages, meant to secure dynasties, usually destabilize them instead. Kings too drunk, queens too miserable, husbands uninterested, wives desperate, heirs non-existent. In the end, the unions forged for political stability created even more chaos. And while the peasants kept sweeping chimneys and coughing in mines, the royals were busy throwing tantrums in bedrooms and rewriting succession laws to fix the mess. Different worlds, equally grim. Drifting ahead. So let's keep floating. We've seen love turn sour, politics poison relationships, and dynasties crumble over bad wedding nights. Next, we might glide over into the realm of royal hobbies. Because if they weren't busy making each other miserable, monarchs were usually developing bizarre pastimes. From pet monkeys in court to collecting mechanical toys, the hobbies are as strange, and sleepy, as the marriages. Strange royal hobbies, because absolute power leaves a lot of free time. Alright. We've floated through royal disasters, marriages gone wrong, and children who never got to play outside. Let's dim the lantern a little more and move into what monarchs did when they weren't ruling, fighting, or sulking. Because having unlimited wealth and power doesn't automatically give you something meaningful to do. And since most royals couldn't exactly go bowling or join a pub quiz, they developed hobbies. Very strange hobbies. Some were harmless, some destructive, and some, just baffling. Let's begin with an old favorite. Louis XVI of France, locksmith of Versailles. Yes, the same Louis XVI who lost his head. Before the revolution, he was already losing focus, on locks. Louis adored locksmithing. He had workshops set up inside Versailles, complete with anvils, files, and intricate tools. He would spend hours tinkering, while courtiers stood around awkwardly pretending to be impressed that their king could file a key. It wasn't just a casual pastime, he genuinely studied the mechanics. Ironically, his passion for locks didn't help him much when he tried to escape Paris during the revolution. The royal family was caught, in part. Because Louis insisted on bringing heavy luggage full of valuables. Maybe if he'd obsessed less over deadbolts and more over disguises, things might have turned out differently. Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire, collector of everything. Rudolph II, ruling in Prague around 1600, basically invented the idea of a cabinet of curiosities. He hoarded art, mechanical toys, minerals, exotic animals, scientific instruments, you name it, he bought it. He filled entire palaces with bizarre collections, automaton birds that sang, skeletons of supposed sea monsters, alchemical tools, paintings of hairy children. His court was a mix of scientists, astrologers, and charlatans. Did this improve governance? Not at all. Rudolf became so obsessed with his treasures that he neglected politics entirely, eventually losing control of his empire. But hey, he had the coolest toy chest in Europe. Christian 7 of Denmark, masturbation as a full-time job. Some hobbies are best kept private. Christian 7, 18th century king of Denmark, took self-indulgence to new heights. He was described by his physicians as being addicted to solitary pleasures, so much so that it disrupted his ability to rule. Courtiers whispered that he injured himself from overdoing it. His mental health deteriorated, his marriage collapsed, and his reign spiraled. Eventually, his physician and his wife basically ruled Denmark for him, while Christian was left to his hobby. Not the kind of pastime that makes it into official portraits, but very on-brand for dysfunctional royalty. Charles VI of France thought he was made of glass. Sometimes hobbies blurred with delusions. Charles VI of France, nicknamed Charles the Mad, developed the strange belief that he was made of glass. He wore reinforced clothing to avoid breaking. He refused to let people touch him. He sat motionless for hours, convinced even a jostle would shatter him into pieces. Technically not a hobby. But it functioned like one, because he devoted endless time and energy to maintaining the illusion. His courtiers humored him, because telling the king he wasn't actually glass could end poorly for everyone. Queen Elizabeth I, obsessive dress collection. Elizabeth I loved clothes. Not just casually, she hoarded them. By the time of her death, she owned around 2,000 gowns. Every portrait shows her in elaborate outfits dripping with jewels, embroidery, and lace. But the clothes weren't just vanity, they were power. Elizabeth used fashion like a weapon. Each dress was designed to impress, intimidate, and project her image as the untouchable Virgin Queen. Still, it was a full-time obsession. Courtiers complained about the cost. Foreign ambassadors described audiences with her as overwhelming displays of fabric. You couldn't talk politics without being blinded by pearls the size of quail eggs. Ludwig II of Bavaria, castles, castles, castles. We've already brushed past him, but Ludwig II deserves another moment. His hobby was building fairy tale castles, like Neuschwanstein. Not one or two, dozens. Each more elaborate, more romantic, and more expensive than the last. He bankrupted Bavaria with his architectural fantasies. But he didn't care. He saw himself as a dreamer king, inspired by Wagner's operas. While the government begged him to focus on actual politics, Ludwig was busy commissioning swan-shaped faucets and gold-leaf ceilings. Eventually, his ministers declared him insane and deposed him. But his hobby left us with some of the most iconic castles in Europe, tourist traps now, but back then, money pits. Peter the Great, giant jigsaw puzzle of an empire. Peter the Great of Russia loved shipbuilding. He'd disguise himself as a carpenter and work in Dutch shipyards, learning to build vessels from scratch. He dragged European craftsmen back to Russia, determined to transform his empire into a naval power. This wasn't just play. Peter literally spent nights hammering wood alongside common workers. Imagine wandering into a workshop and realizing the tall guy covered in sawdust is the Tsar of Russia. It was one of the few royal hobbies that actually had useful outcomes. Russia got a navy. Peter got calloused hands and bragging rights. James I of England, witch hunting as a hobby. James I, the guy after Elizabeth, had an unusual pastime, obsessing over witches. He wrote a whole book, Demonology, describing how to identify and punish witches. He attended witch trials personally, asking detailed questions about the devil's alleged habits. For James, this was entertainment and theology rolled together. Unfortunately, it wasn't harmless. His witch obsession fueled real executions. Entire villages were torn apart because the king's hobby was treating superstition like science. Not exactly as cute as a stamp collection. Napoleon Bonaparte, romance novelist, almost. Yes, Napoleon wrote a romantic novella in his youth. It was titled Clisson et Eugenie. Full of longing glances, doomed love, and melodrama. It wasn't terrible, but let's just say Europe was lucky he stuck to military campaigns. Still, even during his rise, Napoleon loved writing letters full of flowery prose. His notes to Josephine were almost embarrassing in their teenage intensity. He could conquer half of Europe, but he couldn't conquer his own dramatic heart. Weird animal obsessions. Many royals developed peculiar animal hobbies. Frederick the Great of Prussia adored his Italian greyhounds, buried them in his palace gardens, and requested to be laid beside them. Catherine the Great had a thing for exotic animals, including monkeys dressed in human clothes for dinner parties. George III of Britain enjoyed farming so much that he was nicknamed Farmer George. He personally experimented with crops and livestock, though the court thought it unbecoming of a king. Nothing says power like hand-feeding carrots to cows while your ministers argue about colonial policy. The ironic thread. So here's the gentle through line: absolute power often left royals with nothing meaningful to do. Some filled the gap with locks, clothes, or castles. Others spiraled into delusion, self-indulgence, or dangerous obsessions. Their hobbies were windows into personalities too strange, too sheltered, or too bored to exist outside a palace. And while their subjects were grinding away in mines or factories, kings and queens were fussing over gowns, glass delusions, or perfectly crafted keys. Drifting forward. So, let's float onward. We've peeked at hobbies, strange collections, and obsessions. Next, maybe we should glide into the world of royal health and medicine. Because if their hobbies were odd, their medical treatments were downright terrifying. Mercury cures, bloodletting, leeches, palaces were basically horror shows in disguise. And yes, it's just as sleep-inducing as it sounds. Royal medicine, when the cure was worse than the disease. Hey guys, let's keep the candle burning low and settle in. Because if we thought weird hobbies were unsettling, wait until we peek into the royal sick room. Doctors of the past had plenty of confidence and very little science. And royals, being royals, were treated with the most cutting edge, which usually meant the most dangerous, treatments. If you were a peasant, you might get a poultice of herbs and some chicken soup. If you were a king, congratulations, you just signed up for mercury, enemas, and enough bloodletting to empty a cow. Let's glide through some of the best, well, worst, examples. Charles II of England, death by doctor. Charles II, the merry monarch, wasn't very merry when he fell ill in 1685. He had a seizure. His doctors rushed in, armed with their favorite tools, knives, leeches, and concoctions that would make a chemistry teacher cry. First, they bled him. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. Over 2 pints of blood gone. Then they forced down emetics to make him vomit. Followed by purgatives to, let's say, flush things out from the other end. As if that wasn't enough, they applied a blistering agent to his skin. Imagine spicy mustard but designed to literally burn you. Then they shoved mercury into his system. Because why not double down? Charles lasted a week under this torture before finally dying. Most historians agree the treatments did more harm than the original seizure. But at least his doctors got to use their full medical toy chest. George III of Britain, mad or just medicined? Poor George III. Famously mad, though modern historians debate whether it was bipolar disorder, porphyria, or something else. But one thing is clear, his doctors made everything worse. Their favorite cure? Straitjackets, isolation, and something called moral therapy, which mostly meant shouting at him until he behaved. They also bled him, blistered him, and doused him with emetics. Imagine having a manic episode, and the solution is your doctor tying you up and screaming. Louis XIV, the Sun King, lived long, but not without suffering. He developed an anal fistula, which is exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. Essentially, a painful infection that required surgery. His surgeons, being French and dramatic, performed the operation in Versailles. Not in private. In public. In front of courtiers. Because nothing says majesty like an audience watching your backside get cut open. The surgery succeeded, barely. But the doctors were hailed as heroes, and the event inspired a whole fashion trend. Courtiers wore little decorative bandages on their clothes to show solidarity. So if you see 17th century paintings of nobles with random cloth patches, now you know, they were cosplaying Louis's infected bum. Peter the Great, DIY dentistry. Peter the Great of Russia hated dentists. So naturally, he became his own. He carried a collection of dental tools and loved pulling teeth, out of anyone willing, or unlucky, enough to sit still. He yanked teeth from courtiers, servants, even strangers, whether they needed it or not. His collection reportedly numbered hundreds of teeth. It was half medicine, half terrifying hobby. People smiled nervously when Peter offered to help. Refusal was probably unwise, considering this was the guy who once personally executed rebellious guards with an axe. So if your molar was aching in 1700s Russia, congratulations, you might get royal treatment. Literally. Ferdinand I of Austria, the pickled emperor. Ferdinand I of Austria, born in 1793, was plagued with epilepsy, hydrocephalus, and developmental disabilities. Why? In part because his parents were uncle and niece. Yes, the Habsburgs again. So okay dear friend, just rest now. Do you sleep? Good night. Thanks for watching. Please press the subscribe or like, comment, share.